begin tonight, folks. Thanks everyone for coming out. My name is Christopher Harder. I'm the Director of Library and Reference Services here at the Amistad Research Center. I'd like to thank our three invited speakers this evening. We're going to share some engaging and interesting insights into the life of the writer Chester Himes. We'll introduce them for just a minute, but before we begin, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out. You've braved what amounts to a New Orleans winter weather. I hear there's a football game going on tonight. Don't worry, we'll get you home before the Saints win. Sorry, Joe. We're very honored to have these speakers with us tonight and to have you join us to honor what I consider to be an author who is one of my personal favorites, but I think somebody who's overlooked in the literary scholarship. And this evening, we take a look at the life and work of Chester Himes. This is actually the final Conversations in Color for the Amistad Research Center this year. Conversations in Color is an educational series that we began about a year and a half ago that looks to bring in artists, writers, scholars, policymakers to talk about their work and how it intersects with social change. One of the things I'd like to introduce tonight is the fact, and make an announcement, some of you may have seen it already, but we just released the information. Our first Conversations in Color for 2019 is going to be looking at another life of another author, New Orleanian Tom Dent. And so we're going to be happy to have Kalambi Al-Salam and Ishmael Reed on January 16th at Dillard University. If you go to Eventbrite, you can register for that. I'm sure we're going to have a great crowd for that as well. I'm looking forward to that. One of the things that I heard a couple times tonight, and you may have wondered yourself, you received your invitation, you saw this event, why is there a panel on Chester Himes and why is there an exhibition on Chester Himes in New Orleans? What's the connection? Well, one of the things to answer that question, Chester actually did have a connection to New Orleans late in his life, and that came through his brother, Joseph Himes, a noted sociologist. And Joseph, many years ago, had worked with the Amistad Research Center to deposit his own professional papers here as part of our growing collections on African American sociologists. Now, early in his life, Chester had deposited a number of his early manuscripts at Yale University through the influence of his friend, the photographer, author, and cultural critic Carl Van Vechten. But after Chester's passing, his widow, Leslie Himes, was making the decision on where the rest of Chester's papers would go. And Joe had a great influence on that. He asked her that since his papers were already here at the Amistad Research Center, he would love to have his brother's papers alongside. And it was greatly through the influence of Joseph Himes and Leslie Himes that the papers came to New Orleans, to the Amistad Research Center. We're fortunate not to have just the papers of Joseph and Chester Himes, but also Leslie's papers as well, which greatly reflect her interest in keeping Chester's name alive and keeping his books in print. So we have the largest collection of archival material related to Chester Himes, and we're fortunate to have that. The talk itself, the exhibition, coincides with earlier this year the publication of a new biography of Chester Himes by Dr. Lawrence Powell. If you haven't read it yet, I greatly recommend it. There's the cover right there. But with the publication of that biography, and Chester, there's one. Okay, who brought their copy tonight? But we're very fortunate to honor Chester Himes' life and work with this exhibition and this talk. So if you haven't had a chance beforehand, I do encourage you, as we finish up, the cases in the back of the room and actually up into the mezzanine gallery is a wonderful exhibition, if I do say so myself, since I curated it. So, but to begin tonight, again, we're honored to be joined by three individuals from New Orleans, or in New Orleans, who have written about, been influenced by, taught Chester Himes over the years, who are going to give their thoughts on the author and his book. So here's where I'm going to resort to my notes so that I don't mess anything up. But tonight we have Nancy Dixon, who is the executive editor of the New Orleans Tricentennial book, New Orleans in the World. She's written several articles and 2 books on New Orleans literature, N.O. Lit, 200 Years of New Orleans Literature, and Sally Rhett Roman and the Times-Picayune, which won the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities Book of the Year Award in 2000. In 2015, she received an NEH grant for defining, documenting, and teaching Creole culture. Dr. Dixon is a program coordinator and professor of English at Dillard University and has taught Chester Himes' books throughout the years. Joining her will be Michael Allen Zell, who's a noted New Orleans-based writer. His 2 books, Run Baby Run and Law and Desire, are the first of his Bobby Delry series of New Orleans crime fiction and social novels, which the LA Review of Books stated, Zell delivers a successful entertainment, taking a buzzsaw to the glamorous city New Orleans has purported to become since Katrina, shining a light on the city's myth and more globally on the myth of authenticity. And finally, Dr. Jerry Ward is a retired professor of English, Richard Wright scholar, and literary critic. He taught for 32 years at Tougaloo College and 10 years at Dillard University. He's been the recipient of numerous professional honors and teaching awards, and he was inducted into the International Literary Hall of Fame for Writers of African Descent in 2001 and received the Richard Wright Literary Excellence Award from the Natchez Literary and Cinema Celebration in 2011. So I'd like to turn it over to our speakers now, who will fill us in on Chester Himes.
My colleagues have accorded me the honor out of deference to my age
and expertise
to allow me to go first. And they shared with me little summaries of what their topics would be, which led me to kind of reorganize what I wanted to say, but not to change very much about it. Originally, when we were asked to be on program, the question was to explore how Chester Himes had had some impact on the genre of African-American detective fiction, which didn't sit very well with me because I thought that was putting the man in a box. And we have incarcerated and boxed in and buried too many people in these arbitrary categories, which aren't so arbitrary, that the Academy loves. So I decided that one should really talk about detection. Detection, the discovery of facts, the examination of facts, of something that is hidden and obscure, perhaps. So what really interests me about the works of Chester Himes is detection, especially how his acts of discovery incorporate anger and a very productive use of the trauma that he suffered from most of his life. So we can look at detection from at least 3 angles, and this is not exhaustive. First, varieties of detection which are implicit and explicit in the tradition of African American literature, and they're motivated differently than is detection in American literature that seeks usually to erase or dismiss ethnicity and race. Secondly, how did Himes detect in his work what is systemic in American history and society? How did he relentlessly illuminate the absurdity of racism and of raced categories in the practice of everyday life? His observations, of course, are relatively silent about their existential grounding, because he was not less interested in doing that than was his friend Richard Wright, but it is there. For Himes, detection is central in writing fiction and nonfiction, especially crime fiction. And his aesthetic is politically very conscious, although muted in an interesting way. Third, Lawrence P. Jackson, the author of Chester B. Himes, a biography, made very good use of scholarly detection, or detective work, in writing what I consider a most readable critical biography. His thoroughness is commendable. His management of historical facts is a model of how one should use what you gain from archives such as Amistad Research Center. Go back to what I call point 8. However much Black literature is a celebration of a people's enduring in an unfree society that wears the mask of democratic experiment, that literature occupies a space where detecting rhetorical hypocrisy is absolutely essential. As Himes noted in his 1967 essay on the use of force, Black Americans have righteous justification in refusing to applaud the spectacle of progress. The changes in our nation are ultimately cosmetic. Violence and force come in new guises and prevail as we drift from the democratic experiment into a vicious form of fascism. In an essay, then, which is a prototype for those that are now being written about hashtag Black Lives Matter, what Himes detected was that only, and his wording, it's chilling, only the dead blacks lying in the dirty ghetto streets know what it is like to be a Black man in America. Let's have a contemporary adjustment to that quotation. Man means man, woman, and mixed genders. Like other engaged Black writers, Himes detected the location and justification for resentment. In fact, he wrote in this essay, in accordance with all the ideologies of all nations, this, meaning resentment, is right and just. Because the obedience and conformance of the blacks of the United States are imposed by force, theoretically, blacks have the right to resist. Himes then detected, as did his friend Richard Wright, that aesthetically tame literature ought to be complemented and challenged by aesthetically abrasive literature. And as far as his articulation of hashtag Black Lives Matter is concerned, in a prophetic way, what impresses me most is the fact that Himes was giving greater attention to to the black mind than to the black body. I am disgusted with the emphasis on the black body as if African Americans and other peoples only have bodies, but their minds can be dismissed. There's body enough when you read Chester Himes' fiction. Point B, to appreciate the range and depth of Himes' intellect or mind, one certainly should read My Man Himes, an interview he had with John A. Williams in the late 1960s, as it was printed in the anthology Amistad in 1970, and if I'm correct, it's reprinted in Conversations with Chester Himes, edited by Michel Farr. So, if we go back to what the central topic was supposed to be for tonight, Himes' literary work and its impact on the African American detective genre, I think we commit the sin of myopia if we focus too exclusively on Coffin and Johnson and Gravedigger Jones and the doings in the Harlem Cycle. Himes is bigger than that. He is more important for his impact on the whole tradition of African American fiction. His insights about literature and literary politics are remarkable, but even more remarkable are his insights about human psychology, about the foibles and contradictions that define the human condition, the kindness, the cruelty, the surplus of hypocrisy, self-deception, and bad faith. Himes reflected and refracted all these insights in his short stories from 1932 to 1945, the year his first novel, If He Hollers, Let Him Go, was published. I certainly want to note, following something that Lawrence P. Jackson did in his second book, The Indignant Generation, in writing about Himes, that this novel, If He Hollers, Let Him Go, was what I call a proper embarrassment to integrationists and liberals of all colors in 1945, appearing the same year as Richard Wright's Black Boy, because it cast a very strong light on the abyss of class. The real target of If He Hollers, Let Him Go was white liberal hypocrisy and black accommodation to the status quo. The book presents a series of flawed episodes of racial equality and the black pursuit of upward mobility. Those are Lawrence Jackson's words. So I think it is fair to say that Himes made it his business as a writer to detect things from unexpected and very dangerous angles. He signified independence of mind in thinking out intra and inter-racial possibilities. One wants to note especially what he had to say about Williams in his interview about the genre of detective fiction and his contribution to that genre. Point C. Here at the Amistad Research Center and in other archives listed in this biography, Lawrence P. Jackson did the detective work, the research that enabled him to make a most judicious assessment of Himes' life and contributions to literary history. Jackson is eloquent, and he certainly possessed, from my conversations with him, of an elegant, analytic mind. His interpretation of historical fact, or facts, endows the book with a special weight which is dependent on the methodology of detection. the kind that he brought in his first book on Ralph Ellison, The Emergence of Genius in 2002, and his prize-winning second book, The Indignant Generation, a narrative history of African American writers and critics, 1934 to 1960. He gives more than ordinary attention to the history of Hines' immediate family, casting much light on how class, caste, and investment in education imprinted Hines' personality and determined certain qualities, especially with word choice, in his fictions and in his 2 volumes of autobiography, The Quality of Hurt and My Life of Absurdity. In his November 30 interview with the well-known poet out of D.C., E. Ethelbert Miller, for the program On the Margin, WPFW 89.3 FM in Washington, Johnson spoke about the necessity of doing the unglamorous detective work of detecting the texture and details innate in what he said was Hines' political evolution. The sensational becomes the subjective correlative for making private investigations of American mystery, of figuring out that mystery and bringing a certain order to the topics of law and order and law and reason. I will not mention the word justice because it does not exist. The bringing out is tied up with naturalism, critical realism, satire, family, and autobiography. Hines' guilt about sexual being in the world, because he was flip-flopping for a while. And what is very important is his absolute honesty about his prison experiences and his homosexual love affair there, which marked much of his life. Although he decided after prison to be straight as far as we know. The bringing out has to deal with these perhaps unsettling things, and certainly with the jerky success of Hines' career of writing and his prison education, which marks his world perspective. For Jackson, key events were the 1926 accident that left Joseph Hines legally blind. And Chester Hines blamed himself for this particular accident. And the 1930 prison fire in Cleveland that produced a profound trauma for Chester Hines and for any other person who was there. Also key, and because of the way we talk about writers today, is a statement that you will find in chapter 15, page 459 of the biography, where Hines declares, "I don't write for money accidentally. It's my main purpose." I invite you to read the whole book so you figure out exactly the weight of that statement. Jackson knew that archival detection warranted special attention to how troubled but unrepentant Hines was, how steadfast Chester Hines was in refusing to cheapen himself with platitudes, as do so many contemporary writers, how forthcoming he was about the crimes of racism and the crimes of American and other national histories, which is now being brought out by some very bright, brave, and radical historians who are re-examining what the founding of this republic actually was about. So Jackson's detective work is foundational This book is foundational, along with some other works, but certainly this book, for critical appreciation, interpretation, and evaluation of Hines' life work, and certainly coming back to the Amistad and reading through the very rich collection of materials is essential. So Jackson, in my mind, through this book, succeeded quite admirably in informing us just how woke Chester Himes was, long before that slang term had any currency in our minds. Thank you.
Sure. Excuse me, Mrs.
You're resorting to drink?
See if I can end up even Stephen. So Dr. Ward mentioned particularly word twice, once in the title of a book and once in a description of Himes' writing. And that word is absurdity, which is key. But one thing I'm curious about, just for a little background. 5 years ago, I'd heard the name Chester Himes. I hadn't read any of his books. I didn't know anything about him. So I'm curious for the people here, how many people have read even a single Himes book? Okay, so about 50, give or take. I have been a reader all my life. I worked in the book business. And this was a guy that, to me, and trust me, this is not going to be about Michael, but I'll start off that way. And all of a sudden, I pick up Ishmael Reed's interviews, the conversation series, and he's lionizing this guy Himes, that I would occasionally see the books. They come in, they go, they come, they go, but not even that often. And I was so convinced, like, if he's trumpeting this guy this much, the cynic in me came out, like, he can't be that good, right? He can't be that good. That's just the way my mind operates. And I continued through the interviews, more Himes, more Himes. But the thing was, you could never really find the books very easily. You never see them in new bookstores, used stores, rarely. And about a year after that, they showed up for me at a perfect time. Because and one of the things I love about Himes, several things that I love, I guess I'll list a few, is that he was a writer of the old way, the old style, in which if you wanted to write, you lived life and you read books. And then you spent as much time as you could kind of perfecting your craft. When his stories were being published in prison, he didn't have any sort of literary friends who could help place those. It was purely on the merit of the stories themselves. And then those friendships came in time. So when I had the chance to first start reading Himes, I was really blown away. I started reading initially the Harlem detective books, and I hadn't read anybody that was doing kind of what he was doing. And I was trying to find sort of the grounding for the books themselves. And then between the autobiographies and then some of the other literary books, it was really tricky for me to kind of put my finger on what he was about until I read in the intro to the second autobiography that Dr. Ward mentioned, My Life of Absurdity. And I wanted to read this to you because this, I think, is a good kind of point to begin with. So he spent a little bit of time in France. Himes was one of the expatriates that really never came out. He visited the States a little bit. Basically, once he went to Paris, he was in Paris or Spain, as Dr. Dixon will talk about. So while he's in Paris, he's meeting different authors, artists, philosophers, whoever. So these are Himes' words. Albert Camus once said that racism is absurd. Racism introduces absurdity into the human condition. Not only does racism express the absurdity of the racists, but it generates absurdity in the victims. Racism generating from whites is first of all absurd. Racism creates absurdity among blacks as a defense mechanism. Absurdity to combat absurdity. So it was for me. I thought when I wrote The End of a Primitive, I had struck a great blow against racial prejudice. I was arrogant in the belief. I think in a real quick way, the crime books and I use detective novel, crime noir, kind of same thing in my mind. But this to me made sense for those books because the larger than life, it's not a caricature sense in those books, grounds itself in that way for me, for the sense of absurdity. Because what he does, and it's that real tricky fine line as a novelist, that I think by being an expatriate and writing about the U.S. and writing about Harlem while he's across the sea, I think gave him a little bit of that freedom, is that he's true to the people, and there's not a disrespect, it's not an irreverence, but also I feel as a novelist, you can't feel too beholden to your source material, because if you do, you are a journalist, you're doing a documentary. You have to have the freedom that you can kind of play with that a little bit. And this idea of absurdity, I think, is really key in that. At the time, Hymes was really important to me because I was really, I guess, researching, studying, trying to figure out, for New Orleans specifically, how do you, and this is in a general sense, how do you write about New Orleans, and how do you write crime fiction or anything creatively about New Orleans? Because in some manner, you'll always be, I can't use the word Trump anymore, you'll always be beat by the daily news. There's always something that you think, oh, well, this wouldn't be plausible, but then you flip to the news the next day and it goes well beyond what you were thinking. And then you read the Hymes books, and it's just like, oh my goodness, he has these stories that are just so incredible. And what you realize from those books, and that's why the Jackson bio was so big for me, is finding out, and I knew that the literary books, there were issues with critics and prizes and this and that nonsense that he was dealing with, or for whatever reason they just didn't take off. But he was told by the French publisher that, okay, this is what the French people want, and the books did take off there much quicker than they did in the US. But what I want you to do is basically read lots of Dashiell Hammett, because I love Hammett, but I want you to write in pictures. I remember Yuri and I were talking about this, the idea of books as almost very film-like. I want you to write in pictures. I want you to write about what people are doing, not what they're thinking. But at the same time, when you read the Harlem books, for what somebody like Hemingway gets credit for all the time, you get that top of the iceberg, and okay, you know, it's far more easily read than done, but the idea of this motion, and that you're staying somewhat on the surface, while yet you're still engaging the reader and you're rounding the characters, if you follow what I mean. And Hymes does these just masterfully. And especially then after that, reading the first book that Dr. Ward mentioned about his time in LA, If He Hollers, and then Run Man Run. And those books would be, I guess, probably termed more kind of straightforward fiction. I mean, but they're essential. And yet, you know, we have heard of authors at the time of Wright and Ellison and Hemingway and Fitzgerald, but we haven't heard of those, and it's absolutely criminal. What I think is interesting as well with him is, and there's a photo upstairs of him with Melvin Van Peebles, the filmmaker and author and a little bit of everything else too, is that when Van Peebles met him in Paris, when these books were kind of going underway, they've been well received, is that initially when Hymes was writing them, it was completely contractual. It was the first time he was actually getting good advance money, and people liked the books, so he appreciated, you know, the reception in France and eventually around the world. But he told Van Peebles that basically what he did was, see this typewriter? I stacked 220 pages, and when I start to get near the end, I know that's when it's time to wrap down. And I don't view these books as much as anything. The quote that I wrote down was, "These are just a cesspool of buffoonery." And he eventually came around later in his life. He said that these books are, in fact, my biggest contribution to literature, which I found very interesting. The American critics also came around to them. So since I have the honor and the privilege of being able to talk about a little bit one of my favorite authors, and also having these two with their background and expertise to my left, I'd like to maybe pick brains a little bit and see what the two of you feel as far as absurdity throughout his general literary fiction, how you feel like that plays out. Or even to speak on the autobiography, just his life.
Well, I think the absurdity lies in something that Dr. Orr spoke to, and that's the life of the African American and the absurdity of racism, and that the African American man, and particularly in his case, man, is dismissed, disregarded, abused in every way. And I mean, he was angry, as you can read in both his two autobiographies, which are absolutely wonderful if you've not read them. I think they're page turners. And I think that's where the absurdity lies, is in not just in this country either. You talked about the racism in France and in Spain. So I think that it is absurd that someone as brilliant and talented as he is, and his circle, is treated as he is. And so I think I think that's where absurdity lies in his life, not necessarily in his writing.
I would go back to what you quoted, Hines is bringing to attention about Albert Camus. The absurdity in our country cannot be confined to African Americans. The absurdity belongs to Lillian Smith, Willa Cathy, Eudora Welty, William Faulkner, and everybody else, including James Welch. The absurdity is systemic in the very nature of the society in which we live. How absurd for the American people to elect a person who can't write a good sentence, but tweets as if he were a resurrected dodo bird. How absurd it is for people who hate liberals to write nasty comments on Facebook about "get over it, you lost." How absurd it is that civility has been completely replaced since last November by madness. And all of us are affected by it. So we talk about absurdity. We talk about everybody, not African Americans, but everybody.
I'll mention my copy is a library copy, so in a few weeks you may check this out. Don't even try before. For anyone who writes, and I see some people I know of in the crowd who are writers, but really for anyone who either writes or wants to understand sort of the ups and downs of Haim's life, I was stunned. I mean, I knew a little bit about it at this point, but you follow his career through the WPA period. He, in fact, his first published book was a tourism book for Cleveland, Ohio. You find out that he eventually meets Malcolm Little at the time, read Iffy Howlers in prison, who he later meets up with again in Paris. But the ups and downs are incredible. I mean, he spends his time in the Midwest. Dr. Ward mentioned what had happened to his brother. this was essentially a science experiment that the two of them had been working together, where you pour chemicals together and watch it. And Chester, for whatever reason, didn't want to be part of it when they were executing it. And his brother was blinded because when they took him to the hospital, this is the family together, they took him to the hospital, and this was a white-only hospital, so going their merry ways. So he becomes blinded, but is brilliant, so he eventually has success. But Chester Himes is dealing with events like this one after another. He goes to Hollywood. Okay, people think I'd be a good screenwriter. I'll do that. He's there a week, and then Jack Warner himself says, "We don't want somebody like that working here," so he's gone. So he gets to the point, by the time he leaves the U.S. for Paris, he's pretty damn well fed up with everything, and then has enough issues in Paris as well, and then even in Spain. But his life in literature and his life as his life is incredible to follow. What he's dealing with personally, what he continues to deal with, and just trying to get readers for his books. Contractual things, the ups and downs of trying to get someone interested in a new book, and the old publisher tells him, well, you owe us $2,000 and you need to buy 2,400 remainders, things like that. So his success, and thank goodness that I appreciate what the Amistad Center has the man's papers and has this exhibition to bring him back into light. But this was not an easy road in the artistic world, much less in the personal world at all. But it's an incredible life that he followed. And I guess with that, I'll pass on to Dr. Dixon.
I was introduced to Chester Himes. I went to high school in Spain, and I was introduced to Chester Himes by my high school English teacher who knew him, Elizabeth Valet. She was married to a white jazz pianist that played the regular gig at Whiskey Yacht, they call it, downtown Madrid. And in fact, she moved to Alicante, near where Chester Himes lived and died. When she, Facebook, this is what I hate. One of the many things I hate about Facebook is that it reminded me that it was her birthday the other day, but she died like 5 years ago. So I just, I can't stand that when that happens. And so I've been thinking about her anyway. And so she gave me this book back when I was like a junior in high school, back in the 70s. This copy of Cotton Comes to Harlem. And at UNO, I was Bill Lavender, publisher Bill Lavender, who published Michael Zell's detective fiction. Who was also my publisher and partner. Ran the program, the summer abroad program at UNO for 15 years. And I taught the American Expatriate course. And I was tired of the Fitzgeralds and the Hemingways and so I moved, and also I wanted to do, especially when we moved to Spain, I wanted to do writers who lived and worked in Spain. And so I did the African American writers, Frank Yerby and Chester Himes and Richard Wright. And I did Cotton Comes to Harlem, and my students had never heard of Chester Himes. But I teach at Dillard University, and my students have never heard of Chester Himes. So I'm really glad that you're doing this. And I did give them extra credit. They said they would be here, but that's the second extra credit in a week I've given them, and they didn't show up at either one. So, I've taught, the one I teach more often is a case of rape, Une affaire de viol, and which was first published. He wrote it in 56 and 57, and that was published in France in 1963. It's different. It's a departure from his detective fiction. It is it's a crime story, and oddly enough, it's called A Case of Rape. But it's about a perhaps murder, but it's not called A Case of Murder. It's called A Case of Rape. And Himes said that's because when there's 4 black men and a white woman in a room, no one cares about the murder. What they care about is the rape. What they care about is a sexual violation when it comes to African American men. And he also said that it was a story about sexism as much as it was about rape. that, and it's a story about four men, four African-American men in a hotel room, one of whom used to be this woman's lover, but is no longer. And she drinks some Spanish fly, and she doesn't know it's Spanish fly, and dies, and no one really knows why. And then there's a case, a trial, and there's evidence left out that indeed she was repeatedly raped the night before by her estranged husband. And also what it looks at is why that information is left out, why the African American attorney leaves that information out, and why these men are convicted before there even is a trial. And they're convicted, but the sexism comes with this woman. He wrote that Hans wrote that Elizabeth is a casualty of white Christian society, socialized to be feminine, weak, dependent, therefore easily victimized, raped, and a victim of the Christian degradation of the female sex, and the denial of black men's humanity. So they're convicted before anything even happens. It's in 15 sections, and each of these four men is described, their background, their role, their relationship to each other, to her, and then finally the most is concentrated on the sort of trial itself, and they're already tried beforehand. He says that just the fact that rape is the focus and not murder is emphasizes the racist attention on interracial sex, and it's something that he struggled with his entire life. When he moved to Spain, he was worried about moving to Spain, very Catholic Spain, because when he moved there, they were not